Thanks so much again to everybody to coming to our third live event of the day today. There no fatigue setting in, no brain fog, none of that. We're just flying through it. It's been an awesome 2 days so far. So, of course, this conference is brought to you by our wonderful attendees and our sponsors: Holistic Think Tank, Cortico, Antioch University, Education Evolving with Teacher-Powered Schools, and Unruler. And you can find links to their resources and programs in the Discord. And I'll go ahead and also welcome the Contemplative Teaching and Learning Lab team here from the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development as they guide us through humanizing our schools with mindfulness and compassion. And because I know Tish and she's been participating with us here these last couple of days, I'll pass the mic to her. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here with you all. I was saying earlier, I don't know that I've ever presented with such a large group, my team here, but I am the leader of this Contemplative Teaching and Learning Lab at the University of Virginia School of Human Education and Human Development. And we've been working for a while on how to apply mindfulness and compassion practices to humanizing educational systems. And we're going to talk about some of the projects we have going on. This is my lab, and these are the folks that are here with you. And as they present, I'll give them an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves. I am a former teacher, and I used to be a Montessori teacher. So student-centered learning is really a big part of what I am interested in. But I'm particularly interested in supporting adult competencies that are needed in order to do this kind of work effectively. Some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how stress impacts teachers' capacity. And I experienced that myself as a teacher. When we're under a lot of stress, it's very hard to teach. And when our students are feeling stress, it's hard for them to learn. But as I've gotten more in interrogating this issue more, I see that there's multiple levels where these stressors occur. And so I started thinking about something called a stress matrix, which is how all these different pressure points bear down on us as teachers. There's definitely stressors at the classroom level, but there's also at the systems level issues that we need to address. And so when we think about compassion and mindfulness, I think it's really important to understand that it can be addressed, it can be used as a tool or as a process at all these different levels, but it needs to be used in a different way at different levels, because otherwise it ends up becoming like self-care. It just feel better and everything will be okay. And I don't want to give the impression that that's the way we think about it at all, because we recognize that there are systemic issues that need to be changed. But when I first started doing this work about 20 years ago, I started looking at what we call the burnout cascade, which was something I experienced as I observed teachers in a teacher education program. Because what I saw, and I also noticed it for myself, when I felt like the demands were getting overwhelming and I became emotionally exhausted, I noticed my tendency to become more reactive to student behavior. And I didn't understand why this was happening as I observed other people and I experienced it myself, because I also saw as I was observing that it actually promoted classroom disruption, because when teachers are stressed out, that can create situations that cause more disruption. So then I started thinking about this system that we're living in, this system that we're talking about. And when you look at it, it's clearly based on this idea of a factory. It's linear, it's simple, it's predictable, it divides things up in categories and in spaces and times that are not necessarily, they don't function that well today anyway, because learning is a very complex system. It's unpredictable, it's flexible. Nowadays, what we need to do is learn how to learn and to continue to learn across our whole lifespan. We need to figure out how to support the learning of 21st century skills, and we're doing this in the context of a very diverse student body. So you're all probably familiar with these 4 C's: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication. Obviously, the way we learn these skills is by doing things with one another in community. So when I started thinking more about teacher burnout, and I actually wrote a book about this because my publisher asked me, well, you write a book about teacher burnout. And as I started writing it, I realized it was going to be such a downer if I didn't think about a way to support teachers in overcoming this ourselves and empowering teachers to figure out a way to do this. So I started thinking that what we really needed to do was to consider the current demands and resources and how we as teachers can leverage them to improve our schools and our working conditions. And this mirrors a lot of what Cornelius was saying in his keynote, that we as teachers can look at our environments, look at our situations, and find leverage points that we can change, that are within our purview of change. But to do this, we have to change our mindsets too. We can increase our personal systemic resources for teachers, but also transform the work in ways that relieves these outmoded and unrealistic demands and improve student outcomes, which are tied to these 21st learner needs. So what I see is a possibility of a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle, whereby teachers are engaged in work and students are engaged in work that is rewarding, that feels good, that generates more feelings of, motivation, engagement, etc. So one of the ways I like to think about mindfulness is with this quote from that's been attributed to Einstein, that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So one way that mindfulness can be very helpful is to not only be used to help us be more aware of our context and our situation and our students and how to find leverage points to improve the situation, but it can also help us think about what are those systemic issues that need to change. And because all of our human systems are actually created by human beings, that's something that, we often forget, that we are the system. So in order to change the system, we have to change ourselves. And part of that involves changing the way we think about our jobs, the way we think about school, the way we think about learning. And I think often that is a big hurdle because there are already existing sort of mindsets in educational systems that are reinforced. That I guess it's a kind of programming. It's like we're all programmed to be thinking this way. And so one of the ways I like to think about mindfulness is in a way, a kind of a hack. It's a way of hacking the automatic tendencies that we have to think certain ways. It's also a hack that can help us overcome our automatic stress reactivity, because often our stress response is being triggered under situations where it's not really helpful, where our media, our situations are constantly giving us messages to feel frightened or feel upset or angry. And when we don't, the anger and the fear are not really helpful. And what is more helpful is to be more present with what's happening. And when we do that, certain kinds of insight can arise about how to address this better. So I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Pam Nicholas Hoff, who's going to talk to us about mindfulness. Pam, it's passing it to you.
Thank you, Tish. So what is mindfulness? It could be a state of mind, a trait, or a practice. Mindfulness involves directing our attention to the present moment, cultivating openness, acceptance, and curiosity, and sitting with difficult and sometimes unpleasant feelings. While practicing, insights may arise. So if you feel comfortable engaging in a practice, I invite you to join me in a breath awareness practice during which we will focus on the sensations of the breath. So if you can get into a comfortable position and maybe roll your shoulders back up toward your ears, back down again, and adjust your pelvis, maybe forward and backward, imagining the pelvis is like a bucket of water that you don't want to spill forward or backward. And elongating the spine, imagining that you have a string pulling you from the top of your head to the ceiling so that you're in a dignified yet not erect posture. And then if you feel comfortable doing so, closing the eyes or softening the gaze. Feet are flat on the floor, hands are in your lap or on the chair, wherever you find comfort and ease. And then just taking 3 deep diaphragmatic breaths. In through the nose and out through the mouth or the nose, whichever you find more comfortable. Now returning the breath to whatever is normal for you right here, right now. Trusting that your body knows how to breathe in this moment. Now, focusing the awareness on the sounds in the room. To your weight, the weight of your body pressing down. To your feet, making contact with the floor. Now focusing the awareness on the sensations of the breath. Perhaps noticing the cool, dry air entering your nostrils and the warm, moist air exiting. Or the rise and fall of the chest and or back. Or the expansion and compression of the belly. Wherever the sensations of the breath resonate with you right now, right here. Acknowledging that distractions are inevitable, the mind is structured to think. And when they occur, noticing and perhaps labeling with planning, anticipating, thinking, feeling, and returning the awareness back to the sensations of the breath. Not trying to change anything. If it's helpful, counting the breaths, 1 on the in breath, 2 on the out breath, 3 on the in breath, and so on up to 10, returning back to 1. Practicing self-compassion, kindness, patience, being grateful for every distraction, considering it as a bicep curl for the mind, helping us to train the mind through focus. And now letting the mind do what it does, bringing your awareness back to the sounds in the room, the weight of the body pressing down, the feet on the floor. And listening for the sound of the chime signifying the end of our practice. And when you're ready, gently opening the eyes, refocusing the gaze. Taking a deep breath. So typically after a practice, we reflect. So using the questions that you see on the screen, just as a guide, I invite you to write on a piece of paper or record in any way you choose your reflections about engaging in that breath awareness practice. How was it for you? And also feel free to use the chat function to share your about your engagement in the practice. Okay, I see easy for me as I engage in this practice often. Thank you for sharing that, Ray. Macy says, more challenging as I have kids in the room, had to really focus. Thank you, Macy. Misty says, this was the first time I did it with COVID, so quite challenging. Thank you, Misty. And Skylar says, same, but always nice to return to. Thank you, Skylar. Was everyone able to practice self-compassion when distractions occurred? Okay, Brian says, I found it so refreshing and re-energizing. Thank you, Brian. And Macy says, working on that, I think she's responding to the self-compassion and kindness. Brian says, no, I'm sorry. Christy says, also relaxing to just take a moment. That's true. Nick says, I'm afraid I need to work on turning down the busyness. And I think we can all benefit from working on that. Bianca says, honestly, not quite. And Emma says, as an autistic person, I tend to really struggle with mindfulness. Sensory overload is so real, and I am always worried I am doing it wrong, even though I know that it is not a real thing I can do wrong. That's so true, Emma. That's one of the challenges that many of us have. I experienced that too. Am I doing the practice right? But simply returning our focus back to the target of our practice, you're doing it correctly. Sometimes I worry about whether I engage in these practices correctly as well. Yes, Alex is agreeing. And so that's where we are observing, but being kind to ourselves and knowing that there is no wrong way. That each distraction is like a bicep curl for the mind. Thank you so much for engaging in that practice with me. And now,
thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Tish.
And now I'd like to introduce Tara Hopkins, my colleague, another faculty member at University of Virginia.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. And thank you, Pam, for that practice. That was really refreshing. And actually a really nice segue into this next piece, which is to think a little bit about how the underlying role of our emotions and kind of the life under our skin, the physiological components of our experience of the world and how we respond to the world. And when we use this kind of perspective, it helps us both think about human-centered education, where we are now and where we could be, and why and how mindfulness can be a particularly powerful tool. So these three boxes kind of represent a framework for thinking about emotion regulation systems, kind of at the neurological and physiological level, that help us kind of interpret our experience of the world and respond to our experience of the world. There's roughly three components, three kind of emotion regulatory systems that are involved here. One is the threat detection system. And its purpose is to help us assess whether or not there's a threat, and then secondarily assess whether we feel that we have the resources to meet that threat. And the purpose of that system is to help us stay safe, help us avoid harm. It is the most dominant system in the human body. So it is the one that acts the fastest. It's the one that is often involved in our precognitive reactions to situations. And it also drives the very pervasive human negativity bias, which is the tendency to focus on negative instead of positive stimuli and to remember aversive or negative events more than we remember positive ones. And its function, just again, the function for survival. So it tends to be a trigger happy system. It's very easily activated and is often activated in general in the human body. The second system is that drive system, which really its purpose is to seek and acquire resources in the world. So its emotions that it is associated with are excitement, interest, sense of accomplishment, things that are part of your drive to go out and acquire and compete for things that are in the world. In Western society, this is culturally a dominant system. So we have a physiologically dominant threat system that's shared. That's a universally physiologically dominant system, meaning it's just really ready to respond, driven by feelings of offensive and defensive emotions, and this other competitive acquiring system. And the third system is an affiliation system. So the idea of this system is to seek and acquire contentment and satisfaction. And the actual purpose of that system. So some people might think of like the rest and repose response or the parasympathetic nervous system as this. But the purpose of that system is to encourage affiliation and social behavior. That's really what it's there for, is to connect us to each other. So even though, Tish, if you could go back up. Yes. That's good. Perfect. So even though these systems, they organize a set of emotions and emotional responses within themselves. Within a person, they are interacting with each other. So they're co-organizing. They can work against each other. They can work in symphony of each other. But what we have in our culture is this kind of amplification of this threat and drive system. And this is actually one of the profiles that is consistent with clinical and mental health problems, depression and anxiety, where you see the threat system is really amplified with a very amplified drive system. And then, there's both kind of less emphasis on affiliation, but it also gets dampened out by the emphasis on these other systems that are very kind of activating and agitating to the body and to your mind. So one of the things that we can do is the systems are interesting in that you can both practice, you can have practices that stimulate some of these systems, and you can generate in your mind a motive or a purpose to focus on one of those systems. So you can engage in practices, you can have goals or structures in society or in education that reduce that predominance of threat, that kind of trigger part of your system, that reduce the emphasis on drive, and that purposefully by design increase the focus on affiliation. So let's talk about it. Okay, so affiliation, this system is something, and I know Tish thinks a lot about this in her work. Even though it's There's a whole set of universal emotions that relate to the affiliative system. There's a ton of work on child development, teacher-student relationships, about attachment, all bound in the system. We tend to de-emphasize its importance in education design, and particularly the kinds of feedback and educational experience that we give, especially to secondary kids. So this affiliation system, it's based on this kind of fundamental human need for connection. It's part of feeling seen and a sense of belonging in a school environment. And you really have to have valuable opportunities to make contributions for this system to really be activated in a meaningful and authentic way. And it's part of being seen and being a part of really an environment. So one of the magics of mindfulness in trying to amplify this affiliative system is by doing mindfulness practices, you're actually stimulating the parts of the body that are activated when you're engaged in these types of activities or these kinds of social structures. So you're giving yourself an opportunity to find and flex this actual physiological system in your body. And at the same time, you can have mindfulness practices that themselves embody the motive or the desire to amplify the importance of being connected to one another. So on that note, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Helen Min.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Tara. We're going to have the opportunity to find and flex the connection and compassion muscle through another practice in a little bit. But what I want to touch briefly on is a concept called empathy-based stress. And I'm going to move through the slides pretty quickly so that we can have time for questions. So if you have any questions about the things that we talk about, please feel free to type it in the chat or bring it up at the end. So in schools, the challenge among staff and students might be in over-connecting or over-empathizing with students in ways that cause stress. And there's many terms that have been used to talk about this phenomena, including compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and secondary traumatic stress. And we use this term, empathy-based stress, in our research to encompass all of these negative impacts of sustained empathy with those who have had trauma experiences. And I think this definition of empathy is often conflated or confused with that of empathy. Could you go to the next slide, Tish? Thank you. So empathy is the emotional experience of another person's feelings. So in some ways, it's an automatic mirroring of another person's emotion. For example, if you tear up because a friend is feeling sad, you're feeling with the other person. Compassion, on the other hand, is defined as the emotional response when perceiving the suffering of another person and the authentic desire to help alleviate that suffering. So it's not only feeling for or with, but also moving into action and a desire to do something to alleviate that suffering. And this small shift from empathy to compassion makes tremendous changes in our ability to support other people. So how do we transform our empathy to compassion when we're teaching or engaging with students at school? There's many, many ways to do this, but I'll offer a few. Next slide. So one, you could shift your perspective. Research shows that when we reinterpret an emotion eliciting situation, it can change the meaning of the situation and therefore change the emotional impact of it. So it's really important to think about how a student is feeling rather than necessarily feeling with their pain. And I often think about how much do I need to know about their situation in order to help? Oftentimes, I don't need to know every single detail to be motivated to help. Actually, it's more sustainable for me to not know everything. Second, we can show up in small ways. I think it's really important to remember that the presence of a caring adult, just one caring adult, in a child's life is monumental. And us showing up in their lives daily is doing more than enough in their lives. Thirdly, we can practice self-compassion. Self-compassion can be defined as personal acceptance, regardless of if we succeed or fail. So think about how or what kind of advice might you give a friend in a similar situation and offer that to yourselves. And lastly, enlist the help of other people. Research shows that having the support of friends, family, and communities often makes more significant of a difference than having one professional help. So these are some few ways that you can transform empathy to compassion and hopefully have a more sustainable relationship with your helping profession. We're going to engage next in a compassion practice. When we explore our emotions, it often helps to be really gentle and kind to ourselves because we're often very generous and compassionate towards our students or other people, but maybe not so much with ourselves. We are maybe our own worst critics, or we expect ourselves to do everything right and blame ourselves if we didn't meet our own expectations. And we might not have learned effective ways to care for ourselves. And so one of the ways that we can expand our capacity to care for ourselves is to offer this caring and nurturing with practice, a simple practice like this compassion practice we will do now. We're going to engage in a practice that's generating this feeling of being loved or cared for using our memory. And I invite you, when I prompt you to think of a memory, to think of something that maybe feels a little bit neutral, so maybe not super intense, but something that you can feel gently as you step into a practice. If you've done a practice like this before, please feel free to engage in something that is more memorable or more poignant in your mind. Okay, so with the start of a practice, I invite you to sit in an upright position, and this helps you just feel the senses in your body a bit better. You can put your feet flat on the floor if they reach. Your eyes can be soft, either closing them or gaze downwards. And I invite you to keep your eyes and your face soft. Just take a few moments to become aware of the sensations of your breath that we noticed a few minutes ago. Notice how your breath feels going in and out. You don't need to change the rhythm, but just notice it. Maybe you feel the breath coming in and out of your nose, or the soft rise and fall at your breath at your chest or your belly. Now think about a time in your life when you felt loved or deeply cared for by another person. This could be a partner or your parents, your favorite aunt or uncle or teacher, a neighbor, special someone. You could also choose a pet if you wish. There might be an incident in your life that you can recall, or maybe you can't think of a specific memory, but a general feeling of being cared for. Imagine this person or pet or situation or feeling. And think about and sense the care that they showed for you. It might be the pet climbing into your lap to be close and affectionate, or a hug that you shared with a friend. Maybe a gift you received that you were surprised by. A time that you spent with your loved one. And when you remember this time of being loved or cared for, notice any feelings that arise. Where in your body do you feel the feelings? Maybe it's a tingling in your chest. Or maybe you sense the hairs on your arm lift up a little. Stay with that feeling of love or being cared for and see if there's a word or two or a phrase that comes to your mind. If you find yourself becoming distracted by other thoughts, gently just bring yourself back to your breath and then the feeling of being loved or cared for. If you sense this feeling of love or being cared for deeply, see if you can dial that sensation up or down, as if you have a knob on that feeling. Maybe you can explore the breadth of this sensation of being loved or cared for and savor these sensations. As we bring this practice to a close, remember that this sensation of being cared for is always there for you, within reach of your memory whenever you need it. And that your capacity to feel and receive the care of another means that you have the capacity to feel and extend care for yourself. I invite you to set an intention that you will treat yourself and extend that love for yourself like your loved one did for you. Or that you will remember this feeling of compassion towards yourself and others, and will be reminded to extend that. Gently, I invite you to let go of this feeling of being loved and cared for, and return your attention to the sensation of your breath. Maybe take a soft inhale and exhale. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes or lift up your gaze, taking in the sights of the screen before you and joining back in the Zoom room. As you're coming out of the practice, I invite you to engage in another reflection about the practice. There's some questions on the slide, and I encourage you to either jot in a notebook or write in the chat. How is this practice for you? Were you able to generate this feeling of warmth, love, and care? And how did this feel? Where did you feel this in your body? I'll give people a few minutes to respond in the chat. Okay, I know some of you are probably still reflecting. Please continue to do so. Please continue to type in the chat if that's the way you're responding. I'll go ahead and read all of them, but for the sake of time, we'll move it on to the next portion. And I'll pass the mic to Dennis.
Thank you, Helen. That was a wonderful exercise. And so our team is also interested in conditions of systemic inequity related to educators' behaviors in school. And two such conditions are implicit and explicit bias. So Pam will talk more about the effects of mindfulness and what mindfulness can do on bias, or what work it can do on bias. I'll define the terms and some of our concerns related to systemic inequity. Here you see implicit bias is defined as attitudes and beliefs that are held without consciousness, or that are not consciously held or enacted. And it's opposed to explicit bias, but again, implicit racial bias is the unconscious attitudes of stereotypes that influence an individual's behaviors and decisions. So many American citizens have implicit bias. Few individuals in the US avoid inheriting racial bias. And there is a weak correlation between implicit and self-reported explicit bias found in the research. And it often begins in early childhood. We develop implicit racial bias in early childhood. Importantly, it's thought to be a primary cause of disproportionate treatment and discipline of Black students. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So here are some contributing factors to racial bias. Automaticity of response, how quickly one responds or reacts rather in the moment. Sociocultural conditioning and media representation. We know, of course, that because media is encoded with various codes of white supremacist ideology, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. So hearsay, stressful situations, and media representation all help contribute to racial bias. We can go to the next slide. So some of our major concerns in addressing bias and systemic inequity with mindfulness is that there's a major disparity in the treatment of non-normative students in the US school systems. There's racism and other forms of oppression that are components of larger social ecologies of the US. We know that non-white students are punished disproportionately, and that's linked to implicit bias. More recently, microaggressions have been considered to be the primary antecedents of non-white student defiance in schools. We can go to the next slide. I'm personally interested in operationalizing behaviors that have analogs outside of the school systems, but that also reproduce ethics of domination, to cite bell hooks. So here are a few of these racialized behaviors that Black children might face in the classroom. There's teacher anger bias and adultification, where Black students are deemed to be angry when, in fact, they're not, or older when they, of course, are younger. There's the fact that teachers might think that behavior is representative of inherent characteristics, and then enact harsh punishment. And we know as well, and this is one of Tish's findings in 2009, is that teachers' misunderstandings, or understandings rather, of student emotions and behaviors directly affect how they respond to student needs. And we can go on to the next one. Next slide. Thank you. Some more behaviors that I consider to be racialized classroom behaviors are racialized surveillance, the evaluation of student worth, so, as well as racialized grading practices where teachers might grade or reduce the grade just because of the categories of identity a student might fit within or be treated as. I'll leave it now to Pam to discuss how mindfulness might address these issues and concerns.
Thank you, Dennis. So this is what we know about the impact of mindfulness on implicit biases. We know that mindfulness reduces implicit racial and age bias toward individuals without homes, and discriminatory behavior. We also know that mindfulness increases trust toward Black people, concordance between implicit and explicit attitudes, leading to greater well-being, emotional regulation, and implicit and explicit positive affect toward a stranger. I now invite you to explore with me how these factors influence teacher-student interactions within systems through the lens of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Within this model, the microsystem level represents one's immediate environment and factors that directly influence one, such as family, religious affiliations, school, neighborhood, etc. The mesosystem represents the interactions between and among these factors. Both the teacher and student are influenced by and develop within their own microsystems. However, their relationship with one another is developmental, dynamic, and cyclic. In this model, the teacher is depicted as slightly larger than the student due to the collective cultural capital she shares with the other teachers, staff, and administrators in her school, as well as the district leadership. Both the teacher and student hold biases and may experience stereotype threat, which is the fear that one will be judged according to prevalent stereotypes. This may lead to discipline consequences for the student. For example, a student experiencing stereotype threat may avoid being evaluated or judged by disengaging. The teacher may interpret the student's disengagement as a lack of motivation. The teacher may become frustrated with a student and reprimand her for not doing her work and or not participating in class. The teacher's implicit biases may result in her concluding that Black students just aren't academically motivated. The student may believe the teacher doesn't like her and or is prejudiced against her. The student's implicit biases may result in her concluding that all white teachers are racist. The teacher may experience stereotype threat, fearing that she will be viewed as racist. She may withdraw and become disengaged from interactions with the student. The students' and teachers' biases may cause them to treat each other differently. However, the teacher's differential treatment is a greater threat to the student. It may eventually lead to an interaction so negative that it results in an office discipline referral for the student. Teachers deliver and enforce practices and policies that are largely determined at the school or district level. The district level is situated in the exosystem of this model because district policies indirectly influence students and teachers. It's important to acknowledge that both students and teachers' micro, meso, and exosystems are situated within the broader context of an anti-Black white supremacist macrosystem, which results in the development and enactment of policies and practices that lead to the differential treatment of Black students and subsequent discipline disparities. I'll return the mic to Dennis.
Thank you, Pam. Yes, so just following up, it's important to note that even when discipline isn't a condition of interaction between educator and student, racially differential treatment, like Pam has shown, adversely affects the experience. But we believe that mindfulness can make us become, or can help us become more self-aware and better understand our own conditioning that might lead to the harmful behaviors we might enact as individuals with power in classroom settings and in schools and perhaps beyond. And we also think that higher levels of mindfulness can allow us to better assess the actual needs and conditions of our students, teachers, schools, and social systems.
Thanks, Dennis. So I know we've been trying to cover a lot here in this meeting today, but I just wanted to quickly give you a little bit of evidence that some of what we're talking about has been tested in a randomized controlled trial. A program that I led the development of called CARE has been shown to improve teacher and student outcomes. The program was developed specifically for teachers, and all the practices and all the activities are contextualized in the sense that teachers themselves bring the challenges to the table that they work on in the workshop together. But they use these mindfulness and compassion practices to better understand the context they're working in and their own tendencies to react in certain ways so that they are more able to be responsive instead of reactive. In this study we conducted in New York City with 224 teachers, we found that the teachers were improved in their psychological distress reduced, something called time urgency, which I'm feeling right now, honestly. It's when you feel like you don't have enough time because, and when we teach, often we're feeling that. The teachers increased mindfulness and emotion regulation was improved. But what was really exciting to me was that we had downstream effects because we showed improvements in observed interactions in the classroom. We had observers come in and rate the classrooms, and they were more emotionally supportive. And then finally, we also showed that the students improved in engagement, motivation, and reading competence. And we haven't tested yet our implicit bias issue, the question that we're dealing with, but we're preparing ourselves by developing measurement tools so that we can see whether or not this approach can also help reduce implicit bias. And now I'm going to pass it on to Kareem, who's going to talk about another project that we've been involved in with students.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about another project that Tish has led. This is not, the previous one was focused on the teacher development of social emotional skills and based on mindfulness. And this is focused on the students. One of the things that I think it's very important for us to remember is that as much as we teach and dedicate time to children while they learn mathematical skills or even how to ride a bike, we should see the learning of social emotional skills also with the same lenses, right? To give them the time and the space for them to practice, to give them the time and the space for them to learn at their own pace and to achieve those milestones at their own time. So the Compassionate School Project tested and evaluated a curriculum called the Flourish Curriculum. That is a well-being curriculum that is rooted in the compassion and mindfulness, and it's aiming at developing social emotional skills and physical well-being, and kind of like looking at the child as a whole. Looking also at how to support the communities into being more equitable and more caring and supportive. This project has been taking over 7 years, and it's a randomized controlled trial with 40 schools that tested the curriculum for students from kindergarten to 5th grade. It is based on the SEL framework developed by Castle. And some of the components are listed here. So as I mentioned, it includes social and emotional learning. It includes physical activity and healthy eating, mindfulness, awareness. And so it involves kind of the development of skills that nowadays we call those 21st century skills. And the idea is to kind of like get the students to be life ready, not just content ready. Some of the preliminary outcomes that have been found through this study are the increase of the efficacy that the students have when solving social problems. They also have found that it increases the attention and reduces the emotional behavioral problems in students, as well as it protects kind of like the sustainability of pro-social behaviors. On students that were not in the treatment group, it seems like there was some decrease, but the ones that were in the treatment group, it seems like they retain those pro-social behaviors. let me see. So some of the exercises that are implemented with this project implied kind of like some of that breath awareness that we experience today as adults. And the picture here, you can see the child kind of like placing their hand on their chest and their abdomen. This is a way that is kind of like to bring the attention to the rhythm and the movements that are linked to the breathing exercise. And some other ways to engage children into learning some mindfulness skills imply, kind of like also getting to have them move or use their imagination, have them play in interactive ways that foster collaboration. And I'm sorry, I feel like we're also running out of time and some storytelling. So I'm just leaving these 2 minutes in case anybody else has some questions.
Thank you, Kareem. I know we don't have a lot of time right now, but I will be on Discord so I can continue the conversation if anybody wants to. And I just wanted to give you these resources if you're interested, especially a lot of what I talked about comes in that Teacher Burnout Turnaround book. But these are other resources if you're interested in learning more about our work and everything. Thank you, Nick. What we're doing. I guess we do have like 2 minutes. So I think I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any last minute questions or comments in our one last minute here. Thank you so much for engaging with us.
There is this question from Links here, which I think might be related, about the findings of mindfulness reducing implicit bias. So those require some kind of a certain type of practice.
Pam, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I responded to Links in the chat. The research, we've found that both mindfulness meditations and loving kindness meditations have reduced implicit bias. And I think Dennis also included some sources of that. If you're interested, Links, we can, if you give us your contact information, or if we can get your contact information, I think we both have a summary sheet of the research that we are happy to share. Right, Dennis?
Yes, definitely. I'd be happy to share it.
Dennis, did you want to share about the particular, I think it's still on Far Sides, where they use faces, and do you want to share in more detail? I don't want to.
I think I don't want to take up anyone's time really here, since we're at 4, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But yeah, loving kindness meditation helps us better recognize affect and produce empathy, as well as decrease discrimination and outgroup subjects, or excuse me, not subjects, but individuals. And then open monitoring is important in reducing behavioral automaticity as well.
So I know we're finishing up here. I want everyone to know I am on Discord. I'm not sure if all the rest of my team is yet, but I will make sure that everything gets on Discord so you all and my team can send it to me, and I'll post it. But thank you all for coming, and I will see you on Discord and in the other sessions, and maybe even at game night tonight. I don't know. So thanks, Chris.
Awesome.